don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more heartwarming and suspenseful stories just like this one. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring these amazing narratives to life. The harsh winds of the Arctic cut through the desolate, icy landscape. Snowflakes danced in the air, whipped up by the howling gusts, making the world feel both endless and suffocating. In this unforgiving environment, survival wasn't just a fight, it was a miracle. For most, the endless stretches of white were a battleground, but for the young polar bear cub, it was the only world he had ever known. The cub's small body shivered in the cold as he staggered across the ice, the soft crunch of his paws barely audible over the roar of the wind. His fur, once thick and snow-white, was matted with dirt and ice, a clear sign of his struggle to stay alive. He had wandered far from his family, and now, alone in the wilderness, he faced a terrifying reality: he was running out of time. Without his mother to guide him, the cub was vulnerable to the extreme conditions that gripped the Arctic. The cold was a constant companion, nipping at his skin and stealing the warmth from his bones. His stomach ached from hunger, and his energy was rapidly depleting. The sound of his shallow breaths filled the empty space around him, a haunting reminder of how fragile life could be in the frozen world. But fate had other plans for the cub. As he struggled forward, his vision blurred by the sting of the wind, something caught his eye, a shadow, barely visible against the white horizon. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, his body desperate for rest and warmth. But then, the shadow moved. It was a human, a figure wrapped in layers of clothing, their face hidden beneath a thick scarf and goggles. The cub's instincts screamed for him to run, but his body was too weak to comply. He watched, frozen, as the stranger approached with slow, deliberate steps. The human's eyes locked with the cub's, and in that moment, something unexpected happened. Instead of fear or aggression, there was a flicker of compassion, something that resonated deep within the cub's tired soul. The stranger's hand extended cautiously, palm up, as if offering a lifeline to a creature on the brink of despair. The cub blinked, his muscles stiff from the cold, and for a fleeting moment, he considered running. But the warmth in the human's eyes, something no other creature had shown him in this desolate land, told him to stay. It wasn't just a gesture of kindness that held him still, it was the unspoken promise that this human, this stranger, understood the silent plea for help. In the cub's desperate gaze, the stranger saw the weight of survival, the fragile hope clinging to life in this frozen world. And in that moment, something shifted within the human. With a deep breath, the stranger crouched down, lowering himself to the cub's level, and extended his hand further. There was no hesitation, no fear in his movements, just the quiet determination of someone who had seen too much pain to ignore it. The cub took a tentative step forward, his small body trembling as he closed the gap between them. The silence between them spoke volumes, as though the Arctic had momentarily ceased its howling winds, allowing the two creatures to share an unspoken bond. The human's voice broke the stillness. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, his voice warm despite the freezing air. "I'm here to help." The words, simple and kind, echoed in the cub's ears like a lifeline. Without thinking, the cub took another step, his nose brushing against the stranger's outstretched hand. The warmth of the human's touch was like a beacon in the storm, a signal that hope was still alive in this cold, merciless world. The stranger carefully reached out, gently stroking the cub's fur, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had found. He could see the desperation in the cub's eyes, the silent cry for help that had gone unanswered for so long. This wasn't just a polar bear cub lost in the Arctic, this was a soul in need of saving. But the stranger knew that saving this cub would be no easy task. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. The storm was intensifying, and there was no telling how long the cub had before it succumbed to the elements. But in that moment, the stranger made a promise: he would not leave this cub to die alone in the wilderness. The storm raged on, but the bond between man and bear had been forged. In the middle of an unforgiving world, where survival was a matter of chance, the cub had found something extraordinary, a glimpse of hope, a chance for a miracle. The storm's fury intensified as the man carefully scooped the cub into his arms, his movements deliberate and protective. The wind howled louder, and the snowflakes swirled violently, but he didn't hesitate. His mind raced as he thought of the nearest shelter, a small research station several miles away, a refuge in the vast wilderness. He knew he couldn't stay here. The cub's survival depended on getting to safety, and there was no time to waste. With the cub nestled against his chest, the stranger began his journey. Every step felt like a battle, the snow heavy and treacherous underfoot, but he refused to let the weight of the world deter him. The Arctic had a way of testing those who dared to survive within it. The temperature dropped even further, and his breath came in sharp bursts, freezing instantly in the air. But the sight of the cub's frail body in his arms kept him moving forward, each step a reminder of what was at stake. The cub, despite being exhausted and weakened, clung to the stranger as if sensing that this was his last chance. The warmth of the human's body was a strange comfort in the brutal cold, a lifeline that the cub had never known before. His body trembled violently, not just from the cold, but from a mix of fear and hope. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't alone. As they trudged through the storm, the stranger couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn of fate that had led him here. He had been on a routine research trip, traveling alone to study the effects of climate change on the Arctic ecosystem. But now, as he held this fragile cub in his arms, the purpose of his journey had shifted completely. His mission was no longer about research or data, it was about survival. It was about making sure this cub would live to see another day. The wind howled as they made their way through the thick snow, the landscape now a blur of white. The Arctic was both beautiful and brutal, a land where life and death were constantly in a delicate balance. It was a place where one wrong move could mean the end, but the stranger's determination never wavered. He had made a promise to the cub, and he intended to keep it. Hours passed in the storm, but the stranger didn't stop. His legs ached, and his body was growing weary, but he pressed on, driven by a sense of responsibility that had never felt more urgent. The cub's soft breathing against his chest reminded him of the fragility of life in this harsh world. The Arctic wasn't a place for the weak, it was a place where survival demanded everything. But the stranger knew that in this moment, he was the cub's only hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the silhouette of the research station appeared in the distance, a beacon of refuge in the storm. The stranger's heart raced with relief, but there was no time for celebration. He had to get the cub inside, where warmth and safety awaited them. With the last of his strength, the stranger reached the door of the station, his hand shaking as he fumbled for the key. The wind still howled, but now it felt distant, as if the storm itself knew the battle had been won. He managed to unlock the door and pushed it open, stumbling inside with the cub still cradled in his arms. The warmth of the station hit him like a wave, and he let out a deep, exhausted breath. He quickly made his way to a nearby table, carefully setting the cub down. His hands trembled as he removed his outer layers, trying to warm himself, but his focus never left the little bear. The cub's breathing was shallow, and its body was still covered in frost, its fur stiff from the cold. The stranger's heart clenched with worry. He knew that time was critical now. He had to act fast. There was no telling how long the cub had been exposed to the brutal elements, but the stranger wasn't willing to let this little life slip away, not after everything he had done to get him here. He moved quickly, grabbing a thick blanket from a nearby shelf and wrapping it around the cub's trembling body. As he did, he noticed the faintest glimmer of life in the cub's eyes, a flicker of awareness, of hope. It was enough to keep him going, to remind him that the cub wasn't ready to give up yet. He wasn't alone anymore. As the warmth slowly began to return to the cub's body, the stranger found himself sinking into a chair, exhausted but relieved. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he had saved a life. And that was something worth fighting for. The hours passed slowly inside the research station, each one stretching out like an eternity. The wind outside continued to howl, but inside, it was warm and quiet, almost too quiet. The stranger sat by the small heater, his eyes never leaving the polar bear cub. He had wrapped the cub in several layers of blankets, but still, the little one shivered uncontrollably. The cub's fragile body was exhausted, but there was a flicker of life in its eyes. The stranger knew that it wasn't enough just to provide warmth. He needed to ensure the cub's survival in the long run, and that meant taking immediate action. He moved quickly, grabbing a small first aid kit and a few basic supplies he'd brought with him for his research. His mind raced with ideas of how to help the cub, but none of them felt like they were enough. He had read about hypothermia and the dangers of prolonged exposure to the cold, but reading about something and experiencing it firsthand were two very different things. As he assessed the cub's condition, his heart sank. The cub's breathing was still shallow, its eyes glazed with exhaustion, and its fur was weighed down by frost and dirt. The stranger carefully placed a hand on the cub's chest, his fingers trembling as he felt the weak pulse beneath its fur. This wasn't just a case of cold, this was a life on the line, teetering between survival and collapse. The stranger couldn't help but think of the cub's mother. Where was she? How had the cub ended up alone in this frozen wasteland? The thought of the bear's mother searching for her cub, no doubt feeling the same desperation that the stranger felt now, made his chest tighten. He knew the Arctic was a harsh and unforgiving place, but he hadn't expected to witness such heart-wrenching loneliness in the wild. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft, hoarse sound, a faint whimper from the cub. The stranger's heart skipped a beat as he leaned in closer, his eyes searching the cub's face for any sign of recognition or awareness. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, and he found himself staring into the cub's pale blue eyes, eyes that held the innocence of youth but also the weight of the wilderness, of survival in the harshest of conditions. With a deep breath, the stranger gently stroked the cub's fur, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. The warmth in the room had begun to work, but it wasn't enough. The cub needed more. He needed food, hydration, and care that the stranger couldn't provide on his own. He glanced around the room, his mind racing for options. He was alone here, no other researchers, no team members. Just him and this small, fragile creature who had somehow found its way into his care. The wind outside howled even louder, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The stranger knew that even if the cub survived the night, getting it back to the wild would be another challenge entirely. The polar bear cub had been separated from its family, and the chances of its survival in the wild alone were slim. He couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just a simple act of kindness, perhaps it was fate, guiding them towards something greater. He looked down at the cub again, his thoughts swirling with uncertainty. But in that moment, he made a promise to the little bear. He would not let this cub suffer alone. He would do whatever it took to ensure that the cub not only survived but thrived. Even if it meant risking his own life. The stranger had no way of knowing just how much this act of kindness would change both their lives. What seemed like a simple decision, one born of compassion and the desire to help, was about to lead them down a path neither of them could have predicted. The cub, once a helpless, trembling ball of fur, would soon reveal a strength and resilience that would take the stranger's breath away. And so, as the storm raged on outside, the man sat by the cub's side, his hand resting gently on its fur, his mind made up. This was no longer just about surviving the cold. This was about ensuring a future, not just for the cub, but for both of them. The journey had only just begun. The night passed slowly, the storm continuing to rage outside the research station. Inside, the temperature was warm, but the air felt heavy with the weight of the unknown. The stranger sat vigil by the cub, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He had done everything he could to stabilize the cub's condition, covering it with blankets, feeding it water, and offering gentle comfort. But he knew that the real work had only just begun. Survival in the wild wasn't just about staying warm, it was about making it through the trials that lay ahead. The cub's shallow breaths slowly began to deepen as the warmth from the fire and the blankets worked their magic. The stranger's heart lifted with cautious hope, but he knew it was too early to celebrate. The Arctic was an unforgiving landscape, and the cub had a long road ahead of it. It wasn't just the cold that threatened the cub's life, it was the loneliness, the hunger, the exhaustion. The cub had lost everything, its family, its home, and now, it had found itself in the hands of a stranger who could offer only temporary refuge. But the stranger wasn't about to give up. He couldn't. The image of the cub's tired eyes, wide with fear and uncertainty, haunted him. This wasn't just an animal in need, this was a soul, a life, that had somehow found its way into his hands. And he couldn't bear the thought of it slipping away. As dawn's first light filtered weakly through the small windows of the station, the stranger stood up, his body stiff from hours of sitting. He stretched and rubbed his face, trying to shake off the fatigue that had settled over him. The storm outside was still fierce, but he knew he couldn't wait forever. He had to keep moving, keep taking steps to help the cub. He gently lifted the cub from its blankets, careful not to startle it. The cub stirred slightly but didn't wake. Its fur, still wet from the snow and ice, was now warmer to the touch. The stranger breathed a small sigh of relief, at least the cub was no longer in immediate danger of freezing to death. But the road to recovery was still long. The man set the cub down on the floor, taking a moment to study it. The cub was smaller than most, its ribs visible beneath the thin layer of fur. Its coat, usually thick and strong, was damaged from its exposure to the elements. The cub was clearly malnourished, weak, and frightened. But despite its small size and frailty, there was a quiet resilience about it. The cub hadn't given up, and neither would he. He rummaged through the supplies in the station, pulling out everything he could think of. He had a small stash of emergency rations, dried meat, some powdered nutrients, and a few cans of water. He didn't know if it would be enough to sustain the cub, but he had no other options. As he prepared a mixture of dried meat and water, he glanced over at the cub, his mind full of questions. What had happened to its mother? Was she still out there, searching for her baby? The stranger's heart ached at the thought, but he pushed it aside for the moment. He couldn't afford to get lost in the unknown. His focus had to remain on the present, on the little life that needed him now. He approached the cub cautiously, his hands trembling as he held out the food mixture. The cub's eyes fluttered open, its gaze clouded with confusion and weariness. It took a moment for the cub to register what was happening, but then, with a slight groan, it reached out for the food. The stranger watched with a mixture of relief and awe as the cub began to eat, its tiny paws trembling slightly as it lapped up the mixture. This was a good sign. The cub was responding to food. It wasn't much, but it was something. The stranger crouched down beside the cub, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and tenderness that he hadn't expected. Here, in the cold wilderness, amidst the howling winds and the endless snow, this small creature was fighting. It was fighting for survival, for life. As the cub finished eating, it let out a small, contented sigh, settling back down on the blankets. The stranger carefully tucked the cub back into its warm nest, taking a seat beside it. The storm outside raged on, but the shelter of the research station offered a temporary respite from the chaos. The cub had found safety here, but it still needed more. The journey ahead would require much more than just food and warmth, it would require time, patience, and above all, trust. The stranger watched the cub for a moment, his thoughts swirling with uncertainty. He had never been in this situation before. He was a scientist, not a wildlife expert, and he certainly hadn't planned on becoming a polar bear's caretaker. Yet here he was, standing at the crossroads of a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Could he keep this cub alive long enough to return it to the wild? Or was this a fight that was already lost? The question weighed heavily on his mind, but for now, he focused on the cub's steady breathing and the warmth of the fire. For the first time since the cub had entered his life, the stranger allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. They had made it through the worst of the storm. They had made it through the night. Now, they had to take it one day at a time. As the day wore on, the storm outside began to subside, its fury dying down into a steady wind. The sky, though still overcast, had lightened just enough to give the research station a sense of quiet peace. The stranger moved around the station, gathering more supplies and setting up a small space for the cub to rest comfortably. He knew the next few days would be critical. The cub's recovery depended not just on food and warmth, but on care, attention, and time. In the coming days, the stranger would learn more about this fragile little creature, about its resilience, its strength, and its silent determination. And, perhaps, just as importantly, the cub would learn to trust the stranger. It was a slow process, but one that held the promise of something extraordinary, a bond between man and animal that neither of them could have anticipated. But as the cub's survival began to look more and more certain, the stranger couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. There was something about this encounter that felt fated. As if, somehow, this cub's struggle for life was more than just a simple act of kindness. Perhaps this was the beginning of something greater, something that neither of them could fully understand yet. The days that followed were a blur of routine and careful nurturing. Each morning, the stranger would wake early, tend to the fire, and check on the cub. He had taken to calling it Eco, a name that felt right for the little bear, strong and simple, yet full of meaning. Each time he called it, he saw a flicker of recognition in the cub's eyes, as if it were slowly learning to trust him. Trust, he realized, was the key. Trust was what would carry them both through the uncertainty ahead. The cub had begun to show signs of improvement. Its breathing had deepened, its fur had grown softer and fluffier, and it even began to show moments of curiosity. The once lifeless eyes now sparkled with a flicker of energy. Eco would sniff around the small station, patting softly on its paws, exploring the edges of the room and watching the stranger with an intensity that made him smile. It was a delicate balance, keeping Eco safe while also giving it the space to heal and grow stronger. One afternoon, as the stranger sat near the fire reading some research notes, Eco wandered over to him, nudging his hand with its nose. The stranger couldn't help but chuckle softly at the cub's persistence. It was as though Eco had learned that this man was its lifeline, its connection to survival. The cub was growing more and more attached to him, a bond forming in the quiet moments between them. The stranger gently scratched Eco behind the ears, watching the cub's eyes soften with contentment. It was moments like this that made him realize just how much this little creature had changed his life. The isolation of the Arctic wilderness, the cold and the emptiness, it all felt less suffocating now, somehow. In caring for Eco, he had found a purpose, a deep connection to the wild that he hadn't expected. He had become part of the world he had always studied, but this time, he was no longer an outsider. He was an active participant in a larger story, a story of survival, of empathy, and of the unexpected bond between humans and animals. But the stranger knew that this wasn't just about healing Eco physically. He had to prepare the cub for the future, for the wild, where it belonged. It was a painful thought, one he pushed to the back of his mind for the time being. Eco wasn't ready to be returned to the wild yet, not by a long shot. The cub was still too weak, too vulnerable. There were countless dangers out there in the frozen wilderness, unpredictable weather, scarce food, and the harsh reality of living in an environment where survival was never guaranteed. For now, the stranger had to focus on making sure Eco was strong enough to face those dangers. He had spent the past few days reading everything he could find about polar bear cubs, what they ate, how they behaved, and how they learned to navigate the Arctic landscape. He knew that in time, Eco would have to learn how to hunt, how to navigate the icy waters, and how to survive in the frigid wilderness. But for the moment, that was still a far-off reality. Eco wasn't ready for it. Not yet. The next few days brought subtle but significant changes. Eco's fur had thickened, its appetite had increased, and it had begun to move with more confidence. The cub no longer stumbled around weakly, instead, it moved with purpose, its eyes alert, its movements more coordinated. It was as though Eco was regaining the strength it had lost, slowly but surely. The stranger watched this transformation with both wonder and dread. For as much as he cared for Eco, he knew that eventually, he would have to make the hardest decision of all. One night, as the storm outside intensified once again, the stranger sat by the fire, staring at the dancing flames. Eco, now a bit larger and stronger, was curled up beside him, its head resting on its paws. The warmth from the fire radiated through the room, but the stranger felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. His thoughts were consumed by the inevitable truth: the time was coming when he would have to let go. The bond between them was undeniable. Eco had become more than just a cub he had rescued from the wilderness. It had become a symbol of hope, of the power of kindness and the possibility of miracles. But the truth remained: polar bears didn't belong in research stations. They belonged to the wild, where they could roam free and live as they were meant to. Eco's future lay beyond these walls, out there in the icy wilderness, where it would learn to survive as its kind had for centuries. But how could he let go? How could he send Eco back into the unforgiving cold, back into the world where it had almost perished? The stranger closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had promised to do whatever it took to ensure Eco's survival. But survival wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about the ability to thrive in the wild, to find food, to navigate the dangers, and to connect with its instincts. The storm outside howled louder, as if nature itself was urging him to make a decision. The stranger took a deep breath and stood up, gazing down at the cub. Eco had grown, and the stranger had done everything he could to prepare it for the life it was meant to live. He had given it the tools to survive, but now, it was time to let the cub find its own way. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but in the silence of the room, with the storm outside and the warmth of the fire fading into the background, the stranger knew what he had to do. He wasn't just letting go of the cub, he was setting it free. He was giving it the chance to thrive in a world that had almost taken it away. As Eco slowly lifted its head and met the stranger's gaze, the man could see the strength in its eyes. The cub was ready to face the world on its own, ready to find its place in the wild. The stranger reached down and gently placed a hand on Eco's head, his fingers brushing against its soft fur. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with a deep, unspoken bond. "Go," the stranger whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "You're ready." With one last look, Eco stood up, stretching its limbs and moving toward the door. The stranger watched as the cub padded softly out into the storm, its small form disappearing into the white wilderness beyond. For a moment, the stranger stood there, feeling both empty and full at once. He had done his part. He had given Eco a chance, and now, the cub would write its own story in the world of ice and snow. And as the door closed behind it, the stranger stood there, watching the storm outside. He couldn't help but smile, a tear slipping down his cheek. The miracle was real. It had happened. And it would be a story that would live on forever. Weeks passed, and the storm outside the research station eventually subsided, leaving behind a quiet, frozen world. The stranger continued his work, but there was a part of him that was forever changed. It was a strange emptiness he felt now, one that had come with Eco's departure. He had done the right thing, he told himself over and over, but the absence of the cub was a constant ache in his chest. He had heard nothing about Eco since the cub had disappeared into the storm, but the stranger held on to the belief that Eco was out there, surviving. The memory of the cub's small body, trembling in his arms, was still vivid in his mind. But more than that, he remembered the quiet strength in the cub's eyes, the same strength that had driven it to survive against all odds. He had given the cub a chance, and that was all he could do. Then, one day, as the stranger was finishing up a research project by the window, he caught a glimpse of movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the wind, the way the snow swirled and danced in the air. But then it moved again, a dark shape against the white expanse of snow. His heart skipped a beat as he squinted, trying to focus through the blinding whiteness. Could it be? The shape grew clearer, and as it came closer, the stranger's breath caught in his throat. It was Eco, standing tall and proud, its thick coat glistening under the pale winter sun. The cub had grown since the last time he had seen it, its fur was fuller, its movements more confident. It was no longer the weak, fragile creature that had stumbled into the research station. It was now a young polar bear, ready to face the world on its own. The stranger's heart swelled with emotion as he stepped outside, his eyes never leaving Eco. The cub, now almost a juvenile, stopped a few feet away from him, its large eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the stranger's chest tighten. Eco had survived. It had found its way back into the wild, just as the stranger had hoped. And in that moment, the bond they had shared, however brief, was unmistakable. Eco lowered its head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, before turning its gaze back to the horizon. It wasn't looking back, it wasn't lost or afraid anymore. It was free, strong, and independent. The stranger could see the wild instincts in its eyes, the same instincts that had been there from the beginning, hidden beneath the fear and fragility. It had taken everything the world could throw at it and come out stronger for it. And now, it was ready to carve its own path. For a long moment, the stranger stood there, watching the cub turn bear, his heart full of pride and sorrow. Eco had come to him in a moment of desperation, and now it was leaving as a creature of strength and independence. The stranger had given the cub life, but Eco had given itself survival. Finally, as if sensing that its journey was complete, Eco turned and walked away, its movements graceful and assured. The stranger watched as the cub, now a young bear, disappeared into the vast, endless wilderness, the snow swirling around it. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. The miracle had happened. The bond between them, however brief, had been real. But now, Eco's story was just beginning. The stranger stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the moment, his emotions overwhelming. He had done his part, given everything he could. But it was time for Eco to write its own story, one of freedom and survival. The wild was no longer a threat, but a place where the cub could finally find its place. As the figure of the young polar bear faded into the snowy horizon, the stranger couldn't help but smile. The miracle he had witnessed was a testament to the power of kindness, of second chances. And though Eco was gone, the bond they shared would never be forgotten. In the quiet of the wilderness, the stranger knew that he had played a small part in the great, unfolding story of life in the Arctic, one of resilience, strength, and the unbreakable spirit of survival. And with that thought, the stranger turned back to the warmth of his station, knowing that some stories, the most beautiful and miraculous ones, were never truly over. They just carried on, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be told.